No, the this one. This says that it's not. I was in France for a week with no air conditioning. 34 Celsius. That's hot. That's what it is. And now I'm used to that.
Ask Siri. It's not letting you connect to it.
Yeah, I don't use Siri. No, it's down. That's a downgrade.
Whatever voice control thing you have.
I don't know.
Sensing some salt coming from that direction.
Okay.
No.
You interrupted me eating my cookie and respond back.
Excuse me.
I was eating my cookie and respond back though.
Is yours not connecting to?
No, it's fine. It's fine.
Oh, I was just because I was.
I couldn't log on to it for mine, but turns out Cap's like, I could figure it out.
That's not Dude, I live in El Paso, 115 degrees. And we used to not have air conditioning.
It
You
is,
used
but
to.
well, we don't have to. So if we try powering it on.
It's actually not that bad. Dry heat is.
So I think,
Here's some you were out.
like when you talk about gray coding, where's the eraser?
Do I need to?
Have you started up the recording again?
Yeah. Do we want to zoom out and get the board?
I'm gonna I'll bring the board forward again and let's get it on the. I don't know another way to just kind of describe networking real easy other than doing this drawing, and I can't seem to find my slide that has this drawing on it. But to me, the easiest way to kind of get a nice conceptual grasp of networking is to looking at the kind of structure of packets, right? So data packets are designed to kind of cover different levels of abstraction. And I don't know if I need to do tops or bottoms up or whatever. I'm not a networking guy, but I know just enough to get myself into a lot of trouble. Right? So there's a data structure here on computer A, right? And we're going to try to move it over here to computer B, right? And you kind of layer things to cover different things. Like if this is my PC and this is my Beagle, and the way these things are connected up is over USB, then there's different things. So the hardware and some other things kind of take care of a lot of it, but you get to a point where you're actually doing networking, and so you're going to want to, like, here's what I'll call my payload, right? And it's the actual information that you're defining, whatever it is. So I'm not going to define that portion. That's just going to get something that gets shoved down there. But there's different kind of levels. So in USB, there's this thing called there's different ways of kind of sending Ethernet. So it looks like a two Ethernet adapters. So like my computer thinks it has an Ethernet adapter. It's got a MAC address, and my Beagle has its idea of one. And so I need some way to kind of encapsulate that. And this is RNDIS is one specification for that. There's also CDC. And I don't even know what those contain, honestly. I just know that there's some little bits of information in there that kind of say that what I've got below describes an Ethernet packet. But then there's the actual Ethernet header, right? And it's gonna think about things in terms of what are called MAC addresses. So those are unique identifiers that allow to allow different controllers to be uniquely addressed on the network. So in the data, in this data structure that I'm building up, it's going to allow the data to move between the different computers. I'm going to specify a source and a destination MAC address, and that essentially gets defined at this Ethernet level. So that's kind of the layer. If this wasn't USB, if it was actually plugged into an Ethernet network and we had a switch and everything in between, that each of those different Ethernet cards can kind of sort of recognize this data is for me. I'm going to grab it off the network and I'm going to provide it to the computer and say, hey, this is for you. And so this is going to have, it has other information that's useful. It's this layering structure that I want to try to communicate here. This idea that I'm building up data structures, and each one of them's kind of a little more abstracted.
So your large rectangle is a packet?
Yeah, a packet. Yeah, we'll just say that. Yeah, the large rectangle is a packet, and inside that packet, there's different data within it, and it's all kind of built up over layers. The payload is the completely abstract thing. That's what you're trying to move, and then in order to get this to move, there's other things that you have to pile on top of it. So Ethernet with MAC addresses for source and destination, and that's something that's understood by the cards, right? The Ethernet cards. In the case of USB networking, there's no Ethernet cards. This is largely just maintained to say that I'm just sending Ethernet over USB. So it's, but this PC's drivers thinks it does have an Ethernet adapter. So it talks to the driver, as if it has as it's an Ethernet device. So it's going to have to actually be assigned MAC addresses. Past that is this thing called IP, or Internet Protocol, right? So that's generic for anything that's that wants to go across the internet, right? So then you get these things called IP addresses, right? So that would be like your magic 192.168.x.x sort of stuff. So every computer on the internet, or the, if you say it's IPv4, old version of the internet, right? It's going to have an IP address. Now, in practice, not every computer in the world has an IP address. You have things like network address translators, and to kind of say, well, we all have our IP address within this network, but we don't actually need computers in the rest of the world to come and access my computer. Instead, I'm going to go out and access theirs. The router is going to remember that, okay, I was the one trying to go out to get this information, and it's going to remember that. So when information comes back to that router, and it was initiated by this device, it's going to go ahead and connect those two up to each other, right, and send that information back. So that's how you're doing web browsing, for instance. You can sit behind this NAT router, or network address translation, and you just have a link local IP. So there's different classes of IP networks, right? If you see the 10 dot or the 192.168 dot, those are all allocations of different IP addresses that are meant for networks that are not to be generally accessible out on the internet at large, right? If you're at 192.168 or you're at 10 dot, then you shouldn't be hosting www.tamu.edu, right? That would not work for the rest of the internet. But if you have a home router, it's going to give you something like that. So there's just this allocation body for all the internet and they have these servers called DNS. Everything's these just letter things you have to memorize. But DNS is dynamic name resolution. So you actually generate TCP/IP packets to DNS servers. If you configured your local network before, you've seen that you have to give the IP address of the DNS server. Most of you never have, because you use this other magical thing called DHCP. So DHCP says, okay, so I've got an Ethernet adapter. I'm going to send requests out to the Ethernet that gets broadcasted, and if there is a DHCP server on this network, it's going to reply back and give me an IP address. So it's going to be assigned by a DHCP server on the subnet, right? So you've got a router. That router's job is to get you out to the internet so that you can live in the internet. It's going to give you an IP address. And then DHCP protocol is going to have to do that. So if I can speak Ethernet, and there's something on the Ethernet that can provide DHCP, I can then get an IP address. Now, if I want to visit www.tamu.edu, I need to know its IP address. So, if I'm just talking really down beneath you, it's just tell me. But okay. If I want to get to www.tamu.edu, I need to visit I need to ask a DNS server, what IP address is www.tamu.edu anyway? Because I only know how to send IP. I don't know how to access www.tamu.edu. So there's standard that I'm going to send a TCP packet. First of all, the DHCP server not only told me what my IP address is, it also told me the IP address of the DNS server, domain name service on my network is. It told me what that is, so I'm now going to issue a TCP packet that's going to contain a DNS request to port 53 on whoever my router is that has the DNS server on it. And I'm going to say, this is the name, and it's going to give me back a IP address. And I'm going to remember that. Is that wrong?
No, it's just like what he was doing.
Oh, okay. So TCP, right? So here I've got source and destination IP addresses, right? So here, for the TCP level, I'm going to deal with things like ports, and there I'm going to have source and destination ports. There's also interesting things like CRCs for doing error detection. With TCP, you actually have error detection and retries. But there's over IP. There's other different things I could talk. One of them is like UDP. Those are the most common ones: UDP and TCP. And again, in that data structure, I'm going to have a source port and a destination port.
Those are two different protocols to transfer a payload in the IP space.
Right, exactly. Those are two different protocols to transfer data in the IP space.
No one ever told me that before.
Yeah. So the magic is each one of these different layers. I'm adding some extra little abstraction, right? So Ethernet. I've got this idea of these physical hardware addresses. IP layer. Now I've got these IP addresses that I somehow have to map those against names. That happens once using DNS. I find out the name, and then I use the IP address now to communicate to that. But now what I'm actually talking to, if it's like, so we'll go one level deeper, HTTP, right? So if you're doing hypertext transfer protocol, which is like the way you do a ton of stuff on the internet.
That's the encoding of the payload, right?
It is the encoding of the payload, but there's another packet header. So HTTP has extra definition as to what an HTTP packet is. If it's an HTTP packet, that is a type of TCP packet.
Holy cow.
So an HTTP is a type of TCP, which is a type of IP, which can be transferred over Ethernet, but can be transferred over other things besides Ethernet as well. Both Wi-Fi and physical Ethernet look like Ethernet, but there are other physical network protocols. And then if we're doing our little USB connection between the boards, it happens to be layered one more time with our NBIS. So I sent an HTTP request to